The courtroom smelled like old wood and broken promises. Margaret Cole sat perfectly still in her chair, hands folded in her lap, watching her husband David's face transform from smug satisfaction to something she'd never seen before, pure, undiluted terror. His lawyer, a nervous man named Gerald Hutchins, had just finished whispering something in David's ear, and now David's hands were shaking so badly that the divorce papers he'd been so eager to sign were fluttering like leaves in a storm. For 3 long years, Margaret had waited for this exact moment. 3 years of biting her tongue, 3 years of pretending to be the simple, defeated housewife everyone believed her to be. 3 years of watching David parade around their small Texas town like he owned it, while she, quietly, methodically, built the trap that would destroy him. Now, as the color drained from his face and his expensive lawyer looked like he might be sick, Margaret allowed herself the smallest smile. Not a triumphant grin, that would give too much away, just a tiny curve of her lips that said everything words couldn't. She had won. But to understand how sweet this victory tasted, you need to understand how bitter the journey had been. You need to go back 15 years to a time when Margaret Cole was just Margaret Bennett, a 17-year-old girl with stars in her eyes and absolutely no idea that the charming man who would become her husband was actually the architect of her future destruction. Margaret met David Cole on a sweltering August afternoon in Cedar Falls, Texas, population 12,000. She was working the register at Dawson's hardware store, saving every penny for community college when he walked in looking for paint samples. He was 24 years old, handsome in that clean-cut way that made mothers trust their daughters with him, and he had a smile that could convince you the sky was green if he wanted it to be. "Well now," he'd said, leaning against the counter like he had all the time in the world, "I don't think I've seen you around here before." Margaret had blushed. She was 17, and boys like David usually didn't notice girls like her. She was pretty enough, with brown hair and honest blue eyes, but she wasn't the type to turn heads. She was the type to blend into backgrounds, to be reliable and steady and forgettable. David, though, looked at her like she was the most interesting thing he'd seen in years. Looking back, Margaret understood that was his gift, making people feel special, important, seen. It was also his weapon. They dated for 2 years before getting married. Margaret's grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman named Ruth, who had survived 2 bad husbands and the Great Depression, pulled her aside the week before the wedding. "Listen to me carefully, child," she'd said, gripping Margaret's hands with surprising strength. "A woman should always have her own money, not secret money, not stolen money, just her own, something nobody can take from you. You understand?" Margaret had nodded, not really understanding at all, but she loved her grandmother, and the words stuck with her. They would save her life someday. The first 5 years of marriage were good. Not perfect, no marriage is perfect, but good enough that Margaret believed she'd made the right choice. David worked as a project manager for a construction company, and he had big dreams about starting his own business. Margaret worked part-time at the county clerk's office, learning about property records and legal documents, while raising James, who arrived when Margaret was 21. She was careful with money, just like her grandmother taught her. She maxed out her small retirement contributions, kept a separate savings account that David knew about but never thought much of, and when her grandmother passed and left her $85,000, she put it in a trust that would mature when James turned 18. David never asked about that money. He was too busy chasing his dreams, and honestly, $85,000 seemed like pocket change compared to the empire he was going to build. That was his first mistake, underestimating Margaret. It would also be his last. David Cole's construction company, Cole Premier Builders, launched when Margaret was 28 years old. She quit her county clerk's job to help him run it, becoming his bookkeeper, office manager, client coordinator, and unpaid everything else.
For the first few years, she knew every number, every account, every penny that flowed in and out of their business. She was proud of what they were building together. She believed they were partners. But somewhere around year 3, things started to shift. David hired a professional accountant named Rick Thornton, a slick man who wore too much cologne and laughed too loudly at David's jokes. Suddenly, Margaret was told she didn't need to worry about the books anymore. "Focus on the house, on James, on being my wife," David had said, kissing her forehead in that way that used to make her feel cherished, but now made her feel dismissed. Margaret didn't argue. That was her pattern back then. She didn't argue. She accommodated, adjusted, accepted. She told herself this was what good wives did. She told herself David knew best. James, their son, was 15 when Margaret's world collapsed. It happened on a Tuesday night in October, the kind of ordinary evening that becomes extraordinary in your memory because everything changed. David was supposedly at a business dinner, and Margaret was doing what she rarely did anymore, looking at their financial accounts. She'd noticed some strange charges on their credit card statement, things that didn't make sense, a jewelry store she'd never visited, a hotel in Austin she'd never stayed at, a florist that definitely didn't deliver flowers to her. She told herself there were explanations, anniversary gift planning maybe, a surprise he was preparing. But something cold and heavy had settled in her stomach, and her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory, "Trust but verify." So Margaret did what she hadn't done in years. She logged into their business accounts, and what she found nearly made her physically ill. The house they lived in, the beautiful 4-bedroom home in the nicest neighborhood of Cedar Falls, the house David bragged about owning outright, had 3 mortgages on it. 3! The original loan of $380,000, a second mortgage of $320,000, and a third mortgage of $290,000. Total debt almost $1 million, and the house, according to recent sales in the area, was maybe $725,000 on a good day. They were underwater by nearly $300,000. But that was just the beginning. The business accounts told an even darker story. Lines of credit maxed out, tax payments missed, vendor invoices unpaid, equipment loans defaulted. And then the transfers, steady, monthly transfers to accounts Margaret didn't recognize. She followed the money like a bloodhound, using skills she'd learned at the county clerk's office, and what she discovered nearly broke her. A downtown apartment in Austin, rented for 3 years, furnished with expensive furniture Margaret never saw. Credit card statements showing dinners at romantic restaurants, weekend trips to the coast, jewelry purchases that never appeared on Margaret's finger, and a name, Crystal Dawson, 26 years old, former receptionist at Cole Premier Builders, currently listed as marketing consultant on the payroll. David was paying his mistress $4,000 a month to exist. Margaret sat at the kitchen table until 4 a.m., documenting everything. She didn't cry, she was too shocked for tears. She didn't scream, there was no one to hear. She just worked, methodically, precisely, like the reliable, forgettable woman everyone believed she to be. By the time the sun came up, she had printed bank statements, credit card records, property documents, and transfer receipts. She had photographed everything with her phone and emailed copies to a new email address David would never find. And she had made a decision that would take 3 years to execute. She was going to let David destroy himself. She was going to hand him the shovel and watch him dig his own grave. And when he finally fell in, she was going to be standing at the edge, smiling that small, quiet smile that nobody ever noticed. She had won. But first, she had to protect what was hers.
The next morning, Margaret made David's coffee exactly the way he liked it. Black, 2 sugars, served in his favorite mug. She smiled when he kissed her cheek on his way out the door. She said, "Have a good day, honey," in the same mild voice she'd used for 15 years. And the moment his truck disappeared around the corner, she picked up the phone and called the one person who could help her survive what was coming. Barbara Chen was a lawyer in Austin, specializing in divorce cases that involved hidden assets and financial fraud. Margaret had found her name in the county records years ago, attached to a case that had fascinated her. A woman whose husband had hidden millions in offshore accounts, only to have everything exposed by a wife who'd been paying attention. Barbara had won that case spectacularly. More importantly, she'd won it quietly. No headlines, no drama, just devastating efficiency. "Mrs. Cole," Barbara said when Margaret finished explaining her situation, "I need you to understand something. What you're describing, the hidden debts, the fraud, the mistress on payroll, this is serious. Your husband hasn't just been unfaithful, he's been committing financial crimes that could destroy both of you if handled wrong." Margaret's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "What do I need to do?" "First, you need to protect your separate assets, your inheritance, your retirement accounts, anything that's legally yours alone. We need to move fast before he realizes you know." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret worked with Barbara to create an irrevocable trust for James. The $85,000 inheritance from her grandmother, plus the $127,000 in her retirement accounts, plus the $38,000 in savings she'd accumulated over the years, all of it went into a trust that couldn't be touched by creditors, couldn't be divided in divorce, couldn't be accessed by anyone except James when he turned 25. David never noticed. He was too busy with Crystal, too consumed with maintaining his image, too arrogant to imagine that his quiet, forgettable wife might be planning anything at all. That was his second mistake. But Margaret didn't stop there. Every month, she updated her documentation. Every financial statement, every suspicious transfer, every lie David told, she recorded it all. She created a timeline of his fraud, a paper trail that would be impossible to deny. And she waited, because Margaret understood something that David never would. Patience was its own kind of power. Meanwhile, she played her role perfectly. She smiled at David's business dinners, charmed his clients, pretended not to notice when he checked his phone constantly or claimed to be working late. She cooked, cleaned, raised James, and made herself so invisible that David stopped seeing her as a person at all. She was furniture, background noise, nothing to worry about. "Mom, are you okay?" James asked her one night when David was supposedly in Austin for a conference. They were eating dinner together, just the two of them, which happened more and more these days. "You seem, I don't know, different." Margaret had looked at her son, 15 years old, with his father's dark hair but her honest blue eyes, and felt her heart crack just a little. James was the reason she was doing this. James was the reason she'd stayed so long in the first place. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just thinking about the future." "Dad says the business is doing great," James continued, pushing pasta around his plate. "He says maybe we'll take a trip to Europe next summer." Margaret just smiled. By next summer, there wouldn't be money for Europe. There wouldn't be money for anything. But James didn't need to know that yet. The hardest part of Margaret's 3-year plan wasn't the documentation, the legal meetings, or even the daily performance of being a happy wife. The hardest part was Diane Foster. Diane had been Margaret's best friend since high school. They'd been bridesmaids at each other's weddings, godmothers to each other's children, the kind of friends who finished each other's sentences and knew each other's secrets. At least, that's what Margaret believed. It was Barbara Chen who first suggested that Margaret might have a leak. "Someone's feeding your husband information," Barbara said during one of their monthly phone calls. "He moved money around right before you were going to document it, twice now. That's not coincidence." Margaret dismissed the idea at first. Who would betray her? She was careful, private, unremarkable.
But then she started paying attention to Diane's questions, questions that seemed innocent but always circled back to Margaret's plans, her feelings about David, her state of mind. "You seem happier lately, more settled, like you've made peace with everything." Margaret had looked at her oldest friend, really looked at her, and seen something she'd missed for years. The way Diane watched her, the hungry edge behind her sympathetic expressions, the fact that Diane's husband, Richard, had left her 2 years ago, and she'd been spending a lot of time comforting David about his difficult marriage. The truth hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. Diane was in love with David, maybe had been for years, and when David needed someone to spy on his wife, Diane had volunteered eagerly, probably convincing herself that she was helping, that she and David would end up together once Margaret was out of the picture. Margaret wanted to scream. She wanted to grab Diane by the shoulders and demand to know how she could do this, how she could betray 20 years of friendship for a man who was sleeping with a 26-year-old. But she didn't. Instead, she took a sip of her coffee and smiled. "You're right. I have made peace with things. What will be, will be." From that moment on, Margaret used Diane. She fed her friend exactly the information she wanted David to have, that she was broken, defeated, willing to accept whatever crumbs David threw her way. Diane reported everything back faithfully, never suspecting that she was playing right into Margaret's hands. And Margaret added another name to her list of people who would regret underestimating her.
3 years. That's how long Margaret waited. 3 years of documentation, planning, and performance. 3 years of watching David's empire crumble from the inside while he strutted around Cedar Falls like a king. The gambling got worse. She tracked over $95,000 in losses at various casinos. The business debts piled higher. Vendors started calling the house, demanding payment. The mistress got more expensive. Crystal wanted a new car, a vacation to Miami, an engagement ring that cost more than Margaret's wedding ring. David started taking out more loans, using business assets as collateral. He refinanced everything that could be refinanced, borrowed from everyone who would lend. He even asked Margaret's elderly mother for a $50,000 investment opportunity, which Margaret quietly warned her mother to refuse. The house of cards was swaying in the wind, and David was too arrogant to see it. Then, exactly 3 years after Margaret's discovery, David came home one evening with the look she recognized, the look he got when he'd made a decision and expected everyone to fall in line. "We need to talk," he said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. "About us." Margaret's heart was pounding, but her face stayed calm. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" "I want a divorce." He said it like he was ordering coffee, casual, entitled, like ending their marriage was just another item on his to-do list. "I think we've grown apart. We want different things. I've already spoken with a lawyer." Margaret let her face crumple. She'd practiced this expression in the mirror for months, the devastated wife blindsided by betrayal. "David, no, please, we can work on this. Counseling or—" "I've made up my mind." He was already impatient, already annoyed that she wasn't making this easier. "I want to keep the house, the business, and the cars. You can have James. I know how important he is." Margaret almost laughed. Of course David didn't want custody. James was a responsibility, and David only wanted things that made him look good. But what will I live on? I gave up my career for you. I have nothing." David shrugged. "I'll give you $50,000 for a fresh start. That's more than fair." $50,000. After 15 years of marriage, 15 years of building his business, 15 years of being his unpaid everything, he was offering her $50,000 and his gracious permission to keep their son. The insult was breathtaking, but Margaret forced tears into her eyes and nodded slowly. I need time to think." "Take a few days," David said magnanimously, "but I want this settled quickly. I've got plans." He walked out of the kitchen whistling, already mentally spending money he didn't actually have.
and Margaret sat very still, letting the tears dry on her cheeks, letting the mask stay in place for a few more minutes. Then she picked up her phone and called Barbara Chen. "It's time," she said. "He just asked for everything." The next 6 months were a masterpiece of misdirection. David hired Harold Franklin, the most expensive divorce lawyer in the county, because David only wanted the best. Harold was good, thorough, experienced, skeptical. At their first meeting, he told David they needed to conduct a complete financial audit. "No need," David said confidently. "I know exactly what we have. The house, the business, 3 cars, total value around $2 million, easy." Harold frowned. "Mr. Cole, I really must insist." "The business is doing great," David continued, ignoring him. "My wife doesn't understand any of the financial stuff anyway. She just signed whatever I put in front of her." Harold made a note in his file, but he didn't push. David was paying premium rates for this divorce, and if the client didn't want an audit, well, that was the client's choice. He did, however, make sure to document that he had recommended one and been refused. Meanwhile, Margaret hired Barbara's associate in Cedar Falls, a quiet woman named Susan Park, who specialized in looking harmless. Susan met with Harold Franklin several times, always appearing slightly overwhelmed, always asking questions that made it seem like she didn't quite understand the financial documents. She agreed to almost everything Harold proposed. She accepted the $50,000 settlement without negotiation. She didn't ask for alimony, didn't demand half the business, didn't request an audit of her own. Harold was suspicious. "Something's not right," he told David. "She's giving up too easily." David laughed. "You don't know Margaret. She's not a fighter. She's probably just relieved to be done with me." "Still, I'd recommend, just draw up the papers, Harold. Give me what I want." So Harold did. He created a settlement agreement that gave David full ownership of the house, the business, and all 3 vehicles. In exchange, Margaret would receive $50,000 and primary custody of their son. It was, on paper, a complete victory for David. What the papers also contained, buried in the legal language, referenced in attachments that David would never bother to read, was a complete liability disclosure. By signing the agreement, David acknowledged that he was assuming all debts associated with the assets he was receiving. Every mortgage, every business loan, every line of credit, every vendor invoice, every tax obligation. Harold tried one more time. "David, please, just let me conduct a title search on the house, a basic review of the business accounts." "I said no." David was irritated now. "I know what I own. I built that business from nothing. I paid for that house. Everything is fine." Harold made another note in his file, documenting that his client had been warned and had refused counsel. Then he sent the papers to Susan Park for Margaret's signature.
Margaret signed the divorce papers on a Thursday morning in November, exactly 3 years and 2 weeks after she'd first discovered David's secrets. She sat in Susan Park's modest office, wearing a simple gray dress that made her look washed out and defeated. She kept her eyes down. She let her hands tremble slightly as she picked up the pen. "Are you sure about this?" Susan asked, loud enough for the court reporter to hear. "You understand that you're walking away from 15 years of marriage with only $50,000. "I just want this to be over," Margaret whispered. "I just want to move on." She signed every page. She initialed every box. She never once asked to read the liability disclosures, never questioned the attachments, never demanded explanations of the legal language. She was the perfect picture of a broken woman who just wanted out. 3 days later, David signed his copies with a flourish, not even pretending to read them. He was too busy planning his future, the future where he'd sell the business for a fortune, marry Crystal, and live the life he deserved. He signed the liability disclosure without looking at it. He initialed the debt assumption clauses without asking what they meant. He was so confident in his victory that he never bothered to verify what he was winning. Harold Franklin watched his client sign away his life and felt a cold certainty that something terrible was about to happen. But he'd warned David. He'd documented everything. Whatever came next wasn't his responsibility. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for January 15th, a cold Wednesday morning that turned the Cedar Falls courthouse steps slick with ice. Margaret arrived early, dressed in a plain black coat and flat shoes, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like what everyone expected, a middle-aged woman who'd lost everything and was just trying to survive. David arrived 20 minutes late, parking his leased Mercedes in a no-parking zone because the rules never really applied to him. Crystal was in the passenger seat, young and blonde and wearing a coat that cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe. David didn't bring her inside, but he made sure Margaret saw her through the window. One final twist of the knife. The hearing itself was supposed to be routine. Judge Patricia Walsh had reviewed the paperwork, both parties had signed, all that remained was the formal decree. But as the hearing began, Harold Franklin's face was pale. He'd finally done what he should have done months ago. He'd actually reviewed the financial documents attached to the settlement agreement, and what he'd found had kept him up all night. "Your Honor," Harold said carefully, "my client would like to request a brief recess before the final decree is entered." Judge Walsh raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" "We need to review some aspects of the agreement." David grabbed Harold's arm. "What are you talking about? I want this done today." Harold leaned close and whispered 5 words that would echo in David's nightmares for years to come. "You're assuming $2 million in debt." David's face went white. "What?" "The house has 3 mortgages. The business is insolvent. You're taking on nearly $2 million in debt for assets worth maybe $1.5 million. You're $300,000 underwater, and that's if you're lucky." The courtroom was silent. Margaret sat very still, watching her husband's face transform from confusion to disbelief to pure animal terror. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to smile. Just a small smile, just a curve of her lips that said everything words couldn't. David turned to her, his voice rising. "You knew about all of this!" Margaret met his eyes calmly. "I knew about everything, David. The 3 mortgages, the business debts, the gambling, the cryptocurrency you lost, Crystal's apartment. I've known for 3 years." "Your Honor," David was on his feet now, face red, voice shaking. "She tricked me. This is fraud. She deliberately concealed." "Mr. Cole," Judge Walsh's voice was ice. "Sit down." David sat. "Your Honor, I was deceived. My wife hid the true financial situation from me. I never would have agreed to this settlement if I'd known—" "Mr. Cole," the judge interrupted, "did your attorney recommend a financial audit before signing the settlement agreement?" David's mouth opened and closed. Harold Franklin was already producing the documented evidence of his repeated recommendations. He suggested it, but—" "And did you decline that recommendation against legal counsel's advice?" "I didn't think I needed—" "Did you read the liability disclosure statements before signing?" "No, but—" "Did you initial the debt assumption clauses?" "I didn't know what they meant." Judge Walsh leaned forward, her eyes hard. "Mr. Cole, you are a business owner. You regularly sign contracts and legal documents. You had experienced legal representation who repeatedly advised you to conduct due diligence before signing. You declined that recommendation. You chose not to read the documents you were signing. And now you want this court to protect you from the consequences of your own choices?" The courtroom was absolutely silent. "The settlement agreement stands as signed. Mr. Cole assumes full ownership of the marital home and all associated mortgages. Mr. Cole assumes full ownership of Cole Premier Builders and all associated debts. Mrs. Cole receives $50,000 and primary custody of their minor child. Divorce is granted." She banged her gavel. And just like that, it was over. The aftermath began. David didn't leave the courthouse much as stagger out of it.
Crystal was gone. She'd taken one look at his gray face through the window and called herself an Uber back to Austin. By the time David got home, she'd already cleared out the apartment he'd been paying for, taking everything he'd bought her and leaving nothing but a note. "Sorry, babe, I didn't sign up for poor." The phone calls started that same week. Creditors who had been patient suddenly weren't anymore. Vendors who had accepted promises now demanded payment. The bank that held the third mortgage on the house sent a foreclosure notice. The IRS sent a letter about the back taxes. David's mother, Nancy, flew in from Florida to help her baby boy. She'd always believed David was special, destined for greatness, and she'd never particularly liked Margaret. Too quiet, too plain, not good enough for her son. When Margaret came to pick up the last of her belongings, Nancy was there, packing Margaret's clothes into garbage bags like she was throwing out trash. "I hope you're happy," Nancy hissed. "You've destroyed my son." Margaret just smiled that small, quiet smile. "Mrs. Cole, your son destroyed himself. I just made sure I wasn't standing underneath when the building collapsed." She picked up her garbage bags and walked out. She didn't look back.
Margaret's new apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen the size of a closet. But it was hers. She painted the kitchen walls sage green, the color of new beginnings, and hung curtains she picked out herself. For the first time in 15 years, she could breathe. James struggled at first. He loved his father, despite everything, and watching David's destruction was painful. He was angry at Margaret for a while, convinced she'd somehow cheated, somehow been unfair. But as the months passed and he learned the truth, the gambling, the mistress, the lies, his anger shifted to its proper target. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked one night, sitting in Margaret's tiny living room. "About what Dad was doing?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Because you were 15 when I found out. You needed to be a kid, not a soldier in your parents' war. And because I wanted you to see the truth for yourself without me poisoning you against your father." "But he did all those things. He cheated, he lied, he did. And now he's facing the consequences. But you get to decide what kind of relationship you want with him going forward. That's not my choice to make." James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mom, I'm really glad you're my mom." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Real tears this time, not the performed ones she'd learned to summon at will. "I'm really glad you're my son." 6 months after the divorce, Cole Premier Builders filed for bankruptcy. David tried to sell the house, but it was too far underwater. Even after the sale, he still owed $150,000. He moved into his mother's guest room in Florida, drinking too much and telling anyone who would listen that his ex-wife had cheated him. Diane Foster tried to reach out to him, probably hoping that now Margaret was out of the picture, she'd finally have her chance. But David wasn't interested in a middle-aged woman with nothing to offer. He was too busy mourning what he'd lost, too consumed with self-pity to notice the woman who'd betrayed her oldest friend for him. Margaret never spoke to Diane again. She didn't need to. The silence said everything. As for Crystal, she moved on to her next wealthy older man within weeks. She didn't give David a second thought. On the 1-year anniversary of her divorce, Margaret sat on her tiny balcony watching the sunset over Cedar Falls. Her interior design business, the one she'd started with her protected assets, was growing slowly but steadily. She had clients who appreciated her eye for detail, her reliability, her quiet competence. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, the one who'd stayed up until 4 a.m. discovering her husband's betrayals. That woman had been broken, devastated, ready to give up. But she was also strong in ways she didn't know yet, strong enough to plan, strong enough to wait, strong enough to let everyone underestimate her while she built the trap that would save her life. Her phone buzzed. A text from James. "Coming over for dinner? I'll bring pizza." Margaret smiled. Not the small, secret smile she'd perfected during those 3 years of waiting. A real smile,
warm and full, the kind she'd almost forgotten how to make. "See you at 7, she texted back. She wasn't the invisible woman anymore. She wasn't the background noise, the forgettable wife, the furniture that nobody noticed. She was Margaret Cole, survivor, strategist, and the woman who had given her husband exactly what he asked for and taught him the most expensive lesson of his life. The sage-green walls of her kitchen glowed in the evening light, the color of new beginnings, the color of a woman who had finally come home to herself. But here's the thing about revenge, about justice, about finally winning after years of waiting. It doesn't end when the gavel falls. The story doesn't stop when the courtroom empties. Because David Cole wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. And somewhere in Florida, nursing his wounds in his mother's guest room, he was already planning his next move. Margaret didn't know it yet, but the battle she thought she'd won, it was only the beginning.